Greetings, vinyl community. I'm back to carry on with further vinyl finds. Are you ready? Then we shall begin. Starting off with some classic Blue Note action. Wayne Shorter's Schizophrenia. His album, recorded in 1967, not released until 1969. And just look at the personnel on here. Wayne Shorter, of course, one of the greats, one of the titans of the saxophone of our time. Wayne Shorter on tenor, James Spaulding on alto sax and flute. He also wrote one piece on here, Kryptonite. All the other compositions are by Wayne Shorter. Curtis Fuller on trombone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Joe Chambers on drums. Fiery set, really great stuff. Very progressive. He was definitely moving ahead into uncharted vistas at this time. This is on the so-called Black Bee Blue Note label, as released by Liberty. I think this is an early 70s pressing. And it's got the great inner sleeve with the little eighth notes all over it. That was from 1967. From 1977, Barry Altschul. This features Dave Holland on bass and Sam Rivers on saxophone and flute. So you've got 3/4 of the Sam Rivers Conference of the Birds, or Dave Holland, Sam Rivers Conference of the Birds lineup. Muhal Richard Abrams from the AACM Chicago scene on the piano. George Lewis on trombone, also from that milieu. And Barry Altschul on percussion. So Altschul and Holland also, around this time, had recently been members of Anthony Braxton's working band. So this definitely has the flavor of that AACM creative music scene. This is on the Muse label. And leaping ahead yet another decade to 1987, David Murray and his octet New Life. This is a fun album. This is riotous. It's fun in the way that Mingus can be fun. It's not exactly free jazz, but it's loose. And everybody's playing over everybody else, and it's just a big party. It definitely has its hooks in the roots of jazz. There's blues on here. There's plenty of blues. There's Dixieland in a sort of modernized, updated, morphed version. So this is just a wild event, and this is on the Black Saint label. It even comes with, again, a special inner sleeve from the label. And that's it. That's your helping of jazz for this time around. No doubt there'll be more next time, so don't despair. This was one I had my eyes out for. Asylum Choir 2. And like the Wayne Shorter album, this is an album that was recorded 2 years before it was released. It was recorded in 1969. Asylum Choir had another album out that was titled, I think, Look Inside. And it had kind of a disgusting cover. It was a close-up of a roll of toilet paper. It seemed like not the most effective packaging strategy from a commercial standpoint. So that album didn't really go anywhere. I remember seeing it around and going, bleh. Between the release of that and this, however, this fellow here, one Leon Russell, became a big star. So when this came out in 1971, it was quite successful because it's a lot of really great Leon Russell songs. About half of them co-composed with Mark Benno, the other person in Asylum Choir. And there's just really good songwriting on here. I like this better than I think any of Leon Russell's other albums that I've heard. It comes with a little lyric sheet, slightly undersized, but we won't hold that against it. On the Shelter Records label with the sort of egg crate inner sleeve, and this is an original pressing on the non-defaced version of the label. They got in trouble over using the Superman logo for their S. It's sort of an upside-down version of the Superman logo. So they had to scribble that out on later editions. This is the non-defaced version of Asylum Choir 2, Leon Russell and Mark Benno. I think when this came out on CD, they actually credited it as a Leon Russell album. I don't need to tell you much about this. Rolling Stones Aftermath, US version. I really favor the US version of this because I just can't see having the song Goin' Home not be the last track in the running order. It's the 11.5-minute Jagger workout because they don't really jam. They just, and I remember when Sticky Fingers came out, Rolling Stone reviewed Sticky Fingers, which contained their first really long track, Can't You Hear Me Knockin', since Going Home. And the review in Rolling Stone referred to Going Home as demonstrating that the Rolling Stones couldn't conceive of a long track. Well, it said that when the reviewer had first heard that the Rolling Stones had recorded something over 10 minutes long, he was expecting a big rave-up, a big jam with the guitars dueling and so on, and discovered that Going Home was really just a vehicle for Jagger to project through, and that seemed to be all the Rolling Stones could use a long track for. I think it's a great tune. A lot of people find it boring because it is basically Jagger improvising while the band vamps behind him. I like the dynamics of it. I like the song itself. Of course, Can't You Hear Me Knockin' is a much better song, which was acknowledged at least in that review, which was a not hugely favorable review of Sticky Fingers. So they were on the wrong side of history on that one. But again, it's not the case with all the Rolling Stones albums. Generally, with the Beatles and Stones albums, I tend to prefer the ones that I came up with, so the American editions. Even with something like the Beatles' Revolver, there's absolutely no question that the British edition is better. The US version was just abridged. It doesn't have any singles added like all the other Beatles albums did to make up for the fact that they've taken songs off. All they did was take off 3 John Lennon songs, spoiling the album's balance. So by any objective criteria, the British version is a better album. But I prefer the US version just because I have that emotional attachment to it. It's the one I remember the way it goes, and it simply is an album that is unbalanced, that is lacking in the John Lennon input, and that's just the mood and the nature of that album for me. So with the Rolling Stones, it's not always the case. I think there's just no way that I prefer the US Between the Buttons over the British version, but in this case I prefer the US. Definitely Watt, Brian Auger and the Trinity, some very jazzy organ-led sounds. It's got a lot of influence of Wes Montgomery on here. He opens it with a version of the Beatles' A Day in the Life, which is clearly inspired by Wes Montgomery's cover of that, and there's also a cover of Wes Montgomery's own Bumpin' on Sunset. They do a version of Red Beans and Rice by Booker T and the MGs. And if you really want to get back in history as far as your cover versions go, there's a swing version of John Brown's Body which lies a mouldering in the grooves. So definitely What from Brian Auger and the Trinity. Alan Marcusfield from France and Platoc or Platoc. I've no idea what the title signifies. Alan Marcusfield plays guitar and keyboards. The album is primarily just him. He's joined on some tracks by a percussionist and female vocals from Patricia Marcusfeld, evidently either a sister or a spouse, I don't know. Don't know his family history or personal details, but this is really good progressive stuff. The guitar is largely acoustic. He does play some electric lead on here, but the acoustic guitar is played in a very strummy, kind of flamenco-ish manner, and I'm reminded a lot of Ralph Towner from Oregon, or from his own ECM albums. There's also some sort of classical-ish piano, some other keyboards, some organ. The piano tends to play a lot of repetitive lines, so a lot of dramatic but pounding sounds from the piano. And there's definitely a classical influence on here. Very good prog rock on the Egg label. Let's get that out because it's such a great label. From 1978, Alan Marcusfeld, and Platoc. And I picked that one and the Brian Auger up in Berkeley. And while I was on my way to that shop where I found those, I walked past some boxes on Alcatraz labeled Free Records. So of course I passed them by. What's the point of looking at boxes of free records? No. I pulled out an album by the Moody Blues, Caught Live +5. There's actually a little water damaged in here, but the discs are great. Nice live album from the Moody's. Very energetic. I like the playing on this. The Moody Blues tend to be, I think, recognized more as songwriters than as instrumentalists, but there's some very good playing on this. Mike Pinder really goes to town on the Mellotron, so if you're a Tron head, and who isn't, this is a goodie. Side 4 of the double LP is the +5 of the title, 5 studio tracks, unreleased, from the band's peak period, but you can kind of see why these were not released at the time. They're good, but they're just not up to the level of fantastic albums like In Search of the Lost Chord and On the Threshold of a Dream, which the Moody's were putting out at the time they recorded those. Funny thing about this one is this came out when To Our Children's Children's Children was the band's latest album. I should say it didn't come out then. It didn't come out until the 70s, but it was recorded at that time. They only do one song from that album, the opening track, Gypsy. Happens to be my favorite track from that album. Everything else on here is from that knockout trifecta of Days of Future Past, In Search of the Lost Chord, and Threshold of a Dream. So very, very classic Moody's as far as the live 3/4. And the studio quarter is a bit of a curiosity more than really top-notch music, but still very nice. And also from the free record boxes, Melanie, Candles in the Rain, of course featuring the big hit title track, Lay Down, Candles in the Rain, as well as What Have They Done to My Song, Ma? And her cover of Ruby Tuesday, her adaptation of A.A. Milne's Alexander Beetle. Fine album from Melanie. And going farther into the folky weeds, from France, Mollycorn, their 4th album. Has no title. They tended to put out albums that were just called Mollycorn, so they've got this one I think is just unofficially. They tend to be known by either 1, 2, 3, 4 or by the first song on the album. This one is Nous sommes chanteurs de sonnettes is the first song on the album. Very much in the traditional folk vein, like a continental version of Steel I Span, only with more medieval instruments, so you've got that kind of griffin-like approach. Great stuff. This is a particular favorite of mine from them. And on the Hexagon label. Music by the Russian composer Alexander Skriabin, the great mystic composer who was definitely a character. He composed these towards the end of his career, the two great symphonic poems, the Poem of Ecstasy, which the subject matter of which is kind of represented on the cover of this album, and Prometheus, the Poem of Fire, the subject matter of which is somewhat represented on the cover of this album. Got some burning love going on there. Skriabin died before he was able to complete his accumulating work, the Mysterium, that would have been a multimedia event that was to be performed in the Himalayas, and once performed would bring about a new age of Earth. That never quite happened, so we can make do with these, which are very fine pieces. Skriabin was inspired by the atonality of Schoenberg and the Viennese school, but didn't really go in for it himself. Instead, it inspired him to redefine Western tonality in his own way. So you get a very interesting reworking of the chord structures in here, where the music is very dissonant, but at the same time very lush, very powerful and compelling. There is a literal poem to be read in association with the Poem of Ecstasy. It's not literally to be read during the music. It's not sung during the music. It's just sort of a supplement to the music. The Poem of Fire was intended to be accompanied by a color organ, which was performed by a keyboardist and was scored out in the piece, I gather in standard musical notation, but the color organ, instead of playing notes, you play a key and it would project a different color into the concert hall. So Skriabin had a kind of synesthesia where he associated colors with every note and key. So he wanted to have the color of every fundamental note in every chord of his piece to be visible in the concert hall when this piece was performed. These are also known sometimes as his fourth and fifth symphonies, or at least the Poem of Ecstasy is the fourth symphony. I don't usually see the fifth symphony applied to the Poem of Fire, but I have seen it that way. So that's Skriabin. The composer Charles Warrenen and Percussion Symphony. A little bit of a cheat. It's all percussion, but he counts the piano as percussion, so this is not a lot of banging and crashing as you might expect from a piece that's entirely an album-length symphony for percussion. It's much more tonal than that. There's a lot of tuned percussion. There's a lot of piano. He's got two actual piano players and a third player who plays the inside of the piano. So while it may be tonal, it's not traditional. Some electronic music, Gassman and Sala. Electronic music for the ballet Electronics, suitably enough. and Sala's 5 improvisations on magnetic tape. And the point of interest about this album is that it's created on one of the earliest electronic instruments, not a true synthesizer, but the instrument called the Trautonium, which of which very few examples were ever made. So it is a curiosity. It's not a really great album, electronic music, but nice to have that rare instrument represented. And finally, an album of music by double bassist Bertram Turetsky, who was one of my music professors in college. And among the composers on here is Will Ogden, who was another one of my music professors at college. So they're all in it together. Funny thing about this is that it's credited to Bertram Turetsky and supporting and assisting artists. And the other performers are not named, except maybe once or twice buried in the liner notes. And I think the fact that one of them is Bert Turetsky's wife, Nancy, who plays flute, I think she'd get a little bit more prominent credit. I don't know if that was how well that went down at home, but that's how it is on the Desto label. So that's it. I'm going quickly because my battery's going quickly. Thank you very much for watching. Be well. Talk with you again soon. Bye-bye for now.